Hey, today we're going to be talking about sailing and why it shouldn't be a minigame. And I said I was going to make a video about it when I did the engineering video, here I am. What a nice start. Let's actually start with the engineering. So in the engineering video, I said something along the lines of, people wanted engineering to be a minigame, and because it felt like a minigame. At least, old school people did, because, training the skill was boring or whatever, and XP was the part that ruined the skill. And as a result, we actually did have, or at least we did see what happened when we turn a skill into a minigame. And it's a really interesting case study because what happened was that, as a result, we got the Gauntlet, and the Corrupted Gauntlet, which is the harder version of the Gauntlet. Essentially, the Gauntlet is a randomly generated floor with enemies that you kill and some skilling nodes, and you get some weapons, armors that have like 3 tiers, and you can get like some supplies, and after the time runs out, you kill a boss. And if you die, you don't get any loot. I think you get loot, but you just get really bad loot. And if you kill the boss, you just get good loot, and then you repeat. There's only one floor, there's not a lot of skilling nodes, there's not a lot of different enemies, most of the enemies are the same, the boss is always the same, there's no puzzle rooms, and as a whole, I would say that, honestly, the Gauntlet is lacking like 80% of the content that engineering actually has to offer. And most people actually wanted engineering in old school because, I guess people just missed doing content with their friends, and I guess the engineering, the randomly generated dungeons and stuff like that was a fun prospect. It ended up not being that fun because, honestly, I haven't really seen a lot of people talk about the Gauntlet the same way they talked about engineering, and that's because, well, while it might seem, the idea at least, it might seem really good of, oh no, you know what ruined engineering? It was the XP per hour. That's what ruined engineering. In reality, that's actually the opposite. What made engineering good was the XP, was the fact that it was a skill. And that's exactly what I'm going to be talking about and when it comes to sailing, because I think that a lot of people have the exact same mentality when it comes to sailing, where it's like, it feels like a minigame. So because it feels like a minigame, they think that it should be a minigame, and they don't understand how important it is that in reality, we shouldn't take it as a minigame. In the engineering video, I said something along the lines of, skills are to game design what point and click is to game mechanics. Now, I do think that's a bit of an exaggeration. I don't actually think that game, or at least skills, are as important to RuneScape's game design as, point and click. However, it is still incredibly important, mainly because skills end up providing two things that are actually kind of important when it comes to the content in the game and how it's actually designed. The first, they provide actually a lot of things, but the two major ones, in my opinion, are, first of all, depthness to a skill. Essentially, when you have a skill, because you know that you have to fill in a lot of levels and you need to fill in an entire 13 million worth of XP in terms of content, you end up actually releasing a lot more content to it. And because you have the XP in mind when doing the content, usually when you end up doing specific pieces of content or interacting with certain pieces of content, you actually end up choosing to maybe interact with different ones purely because of the XP. The XP ends up being another factor into the amount of content a skill gets, because of you needing to have a lot of content to satisfy players through 13 million XP worth of game time. When something is a skill, you don't. Let's take mining, for example. Let's take Motherlode Mine, for example, and Amethyst, right? Two very AFK mining methods. They give, 30k XP per hour? I think that Amethyst is even worse than that. I think the Amethyst gives like 20k XP per hour. Really bad XP methods that are actually really good because they are super AFK, and they give a lot of ores. In the case of Amethyst, the ores are just, Amethyst that is actually kind of worth a lot, while in Motherlode Mine, you don't actually need to mine any specific ores, and you can get pretty much from coal to runite ore. So, really decent. The thing is, if XP didn't exist, why participate in those specific activities? Why go out of your way and consider those activities? Sure, in the case of Amethyst, you kind of can only get it there, so you kind of have to mine amethyst. But in the case of any other ore, why not just do blast mine? Why not go out of your way to actually mine the rocks that are around Gillenor? Rocks especially that are closer to a bank than Motherlode Mine is, especially you eliminate the random factor from it, right? So when you have the XP come into account, you make a lot of methods more viable, because aside the GP per hour, aside the unique rewards, you also have the XP per hour that people want to take part in and that people will consider. Because when you get 99 in a skill, you oftentimes stop doing it. There's not a lot of incentive to actually go out of your way and doing the skill, because, well, you already did the skill, you already gained all the XP. And that's the thing. Skills provide enough content for you to get to 99, and as a result you need to fill in all of that content. So you need to have enough content and provide enough content in order to have an entire skill worth of content. That's why the engineering has puzzle rooms, different bosses, different types of floors that have different puzzles and different bosses. That's why they have a lot of skilling nodes. You can craft runes, you can invoke creatures, you can make altars, you can do a whole host of things, and you have a lot of puzzles that are based on a lot of skills as well. You have a lot of rooms that are, for example, the combat rooms where you need to kill every enemy, right? These can all exist because Jagex had to make a skill, so as a result they had to make enough content that pushed you from level 1 to 99, or in the case of the engineering 120, because that skill goes up to 120, right? That's why the engineering actually has a lot of content. And the second big reason as to why usually you should have a skill as opposed to minigame is what I like to call the progression rewards. Essentially, progression rewards are the content that you unlock alongside the skill. To simply put, when you train with cutting, for example, with cutting is all about cutting different trees, right? But the thing is, some trees aren't exactly available from the get-go. You only have, normal trees first, and then you unlock oak trees, and then willow trees, and then maple trees, and so on, right? This is because when you have a skill, or when you make something into a skill, you make sure that people will actually engage with different types of content, and you give them a reason to actually engage with different types of content. Because if you don't have the XP outside of GP per hour and maybe some exclusive rewards, there really isn't a lot of reason to interact with a specific section of a skill if there isn't a skill to be had there, right? If there isn't a reward to be gained from it, which, a lot of the times that reward is specifically the fact that when you have a skill and you need specific levels or gain XP to get specific levels to unlock pieces of content, that's the reason as to why you end up doing that skill. If magic logs are super valuable, if yew logs are decently valuable, why not just do those over willow logs, for example, over oak logs? Doing those things is, well, kind of useless. It's, they wouldn't need to be a thing if you didn't have the skill. But because you need to unlock willow logs, you need to unlock the ability to cut magic logs, you essentially have that progression there, where you are justified to actually go out of your way, engage with multiple parts of the skill, just so you can unlock other parts of the skill. The content isn't just in the game, there's also progression to be had within that content, be it with gaining GP, with unique rewards, or just gaining XP to unlock other parts of the skill, right? So when you have a minigame, you simply cannot afford that, because a minigame isn't the skill. It doesn't give you XP, it doesn't give you the ability to get items for other skills that also rely on gaining XP, right? And since I already mentioned with carrying, I know that some of you will probably say, but oak logs are, really useful because you can use them in construction. Cool, what if construction wasn't a skill as well? What if flashing wasn't a skill as well? What if none of those things were a skill? So essentially, while you do still need these items, you don't need them as in high quantity as you need them right now. Because right now you need them in high quantity because you need to gain XP in those skills. If you didn't need to gain XP in those skills, a lot of these items are just straight up useless. There's no actual progression to be had. A lot of the content in the game just gets useless. Not just because, you don't have the skill relevant to it, but because the one that is relevant, you can just skip right to it. If I make GP by making runite items, why do I bother making Addy or Mithril items? There's no point, right? There's no XP to be gained. There's nothing else to be gained, and this is the best GP per hour. Sure, they are rarer, runite items actually, and runite rocks at least, take longer to respawn than Addy ores, for example. Yeah, but this only happens because there's progression in a skill, because these are higher level ores, because you need a higher level to unlock them. They are a higher reward, but they also need to be rarer because they are higher level. The rarity is supposed to be higher because they're also worth more. They're more useful for the game. This is all, everything plays into the progression of a skill and the rewards that you gain, which is the, content that you unlock as you go through it. When you don't have a skill in the game, a lot of the progression just becomes useless, especially in combat, for example. A lot of armor and weapons that exists in the game are only useful if you have a certain progression to be had in the game. If you don't have, let's say, attack levels or strength levels, what is the point of buying a rune scimitar? What's the point of getting a dragon scimitar? Just get a whip, is decently cheap, and you don't really need to use anything else, and then you gain the GP to buy the super expensive weapons. There's no point in using maybe a, obby weapon. There's no point in using a brine saber. All of these items that are more situational, that have more to do with your budget, considering what levels you have. When you don't have levels, you don't need any of that. And that's exactly the problem. When we grab all of these into sailing, we wouldn't have as much content into sailing as we have right now if it wasn't a skill, because you wouldn't have 13 million XP worth of content to be had in the skill. And even then, that's just the skill at release. As we've seen with a lot of other skills, there's a lot of reason to add content into these skills as a way of actually using the items and turn them into XP. There's a lot of stuff that was added into the game just to add specific items that didn't have a use, to give them the use of gaining XP in a specific skill. Right? Gaining XP gives reason and gives a lot of use to a lot of items. It gives use to a lot of different activities in the game that give those items. So in sailing, all of these activities, most of them would be useless if you don't have a progression in a skill, if you don't unlock new content by leveling up your sailing level. What is the point exactly of having all of this content? Essentially, sailing would actually be a worse piece of content in the game, like the gauntlet, for example, when contrasted with engineering, if you simply didn't have as much content to be unlocked as you go. And that unlocking also really matters, because if there's nothing to unlock, most people wouldn't even do the content that is in the game related to sailing if it weren't a skill, because if there's no XP incentive, people would only either care about the unique rewards, or people would only care about the GP per hour that you get. There isn't XP per hour, there isn't a progression, there isn't you unlock this piece of content that is really good at level 85, like Slayer, oh yeah, at level 85 you unlock Abyssal Demons, they're really good XP and they give Abyssal Whip. Yeah, but you need to train for it, you need to actually train to get there. If something isn't a skill, you don't. You have everything available from the get-go. And while I don't doubt that Jagex can actually create pretty complex systems, as I've said in my invention video, I think that invention is a good system on its own that didn't need to be a skill, but I understand why it is a skill. Again, progression, it also makes it much more digestible for people to actually approach the skill, which is another thing, right? In terms of invention, invention has way too much content for you to unlock it all from the get-go, right? So it actually helps spacing out a skill and, making people accustomed to a skill. When you look at archaeology, for example, archaeology has a lot of content that didn't need necessarily to be a skill in the terms of the collections that you can complete and the mysteries that you can complete. But again, being a skill helps it pace it out. It gives more reason for you to do the different activities within the content that was released for the skill specifically. Because A, you need to unlock the content by gaining XP, and B, because you gain XP, you actually have a reason to actually do that content. That's why sailing shouldn't really be a minigame. I know that there's this argument that it feels like one, but something feeling like a minigame doesn't make it better by being one. This notion that sailing should be a minigame is one that essentially thinks that sailing being a minigame would be better than sailing being a skill. And I think it's completely the opposite. I think that if sailing were to be a minigame and were to be designed as a minigame, with minigame rewards in mind and minigame gameplay in mind, and just overall the design philosophy was for it to be a minigame, it would actually be worse content than it being a skill. From what we've already been presented in sailing, I think that it being a skill is exactly why we were presented all of this content. If sailing were to be a minigame, most of this content wouldn't exist, which I would argue would actually make the entire piece of content way worse. And honestly, do we really want a second gauntlet in the game? Do we really want to taunt these amazing skills that can be released to then just release something that is completely subpar? Yeah, that's the thing. RuneScape can 100% exist without having skills or XP, but it would be a far worse game for it.